Hello everyone, ODDISHHIME here, and today I'm talking about a question that I've seen coming up a lot in online spaces a lot recently, and that's whatever happened to Pokémon Ranger and why has it just dropped off the face of the earth? Pokémon Ranger is one of my absolute favourite Pokémon games of all time. It's easily my favourite spin-off concept, and I recently revisited all three of the games and it just reminded me how special these games are to me. Pokémon Ranger's first game released in 2006 in Japan and was released in the West in 2007. It spawned 2 sequels, an anime movie, and TV specials. But since Gen 4 ended, the concept seemed to kind of just get forgotten about. I actually got the first game on its release day. It's one of my fondest childhood memories. As these were the days where Japan was getting games way ahead of the West, the Pokémon magazine I used to read as a kid did a lot of coverage on the game before its release, and I knew from what I was reading that I really wanted it. I remember one issue of the magazine gave out this free DVD and it had trailers for loads of upcoming games on it, and it featured like clips of gameplay and little snippets of interviews, and I used to watch this on repeat until I managed to get my little grubby child hands on Pokémon Ranger. The key gimmick of this game is that instead of catching and training and raising your Pokémon, you're playing as a ranger and you just temporarily befriend them to help protect nature. This is done using the capture styler. These games introduce a whole new culture to what the mainline games had established, and we learn that there are regions where capturing Pokemon in Pokeballs is kind of a foreign concept and not done at all. I think this was a really good part of deepening the world building of the Pokemon world, and it really emphasises that the Ranger regions are completely separate to the regions we're familiar with from the main games. Befriending the Pokemon and using their abilities is absolutely key to progressing in the game. You cannot go further without doing it, and this is done to reinforce the values of the Ranger that the game is preaching. As I mentioned earlier, the Rangers have appeared a few times in the anime. For example, the 9th movie was a Ranger tie-in and had a Ranger who was just exclusive to this movie called Jack Walker. One of the protagonists of the original Ranger game, Solana, appeared in an episode of the anime, and there was even a TV special focusing on the Shadows of Almia game. The Pokémon Ranger movie actually was a tie-in to promote the Manaphy event you could achieve at the end of the game. This was 1 per cartridge, and nowadays, if you're trying to get hold of it, it is really annoying because most people claimed that egg as soon as they got the game. Something I see a lot of is the games being praised for being more visually detailed than the mainline ones, with more complex environments and more complex character sprites. You even get the chance to walk diagonally. Something immediately noticeable about the Ranger games is that the character sprites aren't the classic chibi style and more to scale than traditional. This gives the sprites a bit more personality, as more small details and motion animations are possible with this size than they are with the chibi. For example, each Ranger character has their own signature pose, and some characters even have unique walk cycles and body types. I've actually always preferred this to the compressed chibi style of the main series, and even as a kid, I wondered why on earth they weren't sticking to the Ranger style for every game. Every Pokemon in the game received a brand new sprite from the main series, and these are so good. Like, clearly a lot of work went into creating the unique movements and attack patterns. Because they're static in the mainline games, this is the first time you really get to see the Pokemon in proper action, and the pixel art is just absolutely beautiful. Every little detail about this game makes it feel incredibly immersive, and it makes you feel really connected with your character and the story of the world. These games really went to town taking advantage of the touchscreen of the DS, and these are actually the only DS titles where the gameplay takes place on the lower screen instead of the top. The touchscreen can be used not only for the captures, but to control your character where they walk, meaning that for the first time you can walk in every direction on the axis, and you can also interact with the world around you by tapping on objects for a closer look. You can also tap Pokemon in the field to inspect them and check their data and their stats. The first Pokemon Ranger game is set in the region of Fior, and you choose between playing as either Salona or Lunatic. Fior is based on Okayama and Hyogo and Shodo Island in Kagawa, much like how Hoenn is based on Kyushu and Sinnoh is based on Hokkaido. This is the only instrument of the series to be a Gen 3 game. Its release only very slightly preceded Diamond and Pearl, and it linked the generations together with the Manaphy Egg event. There's also some Gen 3 tie-in events post-game, like a Deoxys mission. 210 of the 386 existing Pokemon at the time were available in this game, but the way they picked them was kind of bizarre because some don't even have their full evolution line available. For example, Bellsprout's whole line is all there, but you can only find Slowpoke and none of its evolutions. Fior has 4 Ranger bases, each one set in a location based on a different season: Summerland, Fall City, Windtown, and Ringtown. The story of this game sees you as a newbie ranger chasing down the Go Rock squad. These are really camp ABBA looking villains, and their goal is kind of just to steal the styler and reproduce it as their own evil version. By reproducing the evil styler, they just want to control Pokemon and use them to take over the region, basically. I think this is a really simple concept. It's kind of reminiscent of how simple the Gen 1 Team Rocket ambitions were. And I think it's a nice way to just ease you into the concept. It's not an overly complex story to overwhelm you with all of the other new things that this game introduces. It's a really, really fun replay. I kind of revisit it as often as I can. It has such a special place in my heart. I'm actually working on a cosplay of Solana because I love her so much. The second game is titled Shadows of Almia, and in this game you play as either Kate or Keith. Only 270 of the 493 existing Pokemon are available in this game, but this game is a Gen 4 game. Almia could be based upon the tale of Hokkaido. The game states that Almia is the closest region to Sinnoh, and they address this in the Manaphy Egg event. This used to be the only way to get Manaphy outside of events. This installment to the series introduced the concept of the Ranger School, and it establishes that you must complete a course and intensive training to become a Ranger. I really enjoyed this part of the game at the beginning, and it feels like a really fun version of doing a tutorial. I kind of wish that this had been the way they did a tutorial in the first game, as with Rangers being such a brand new concept, I think maybe starting in a school is a good way to ease you into a new concept. It's also a really fun way to introduce and flesh out a lot of the important main characters. At the Ranger School you can train to either be a Ranger or Operator, and one of the characters you befriend in the story is a girl called Rivmi. She wants to become an Operator. She becomes a recurring part of the story and one of your best friends, and she becomes sort of an assistant to you back at the Ranger HQ. I think little things like this, like bringing in all the characters as often as possible, makes the game feel really immersive and alive, and obviously it deepens your connection to the story. Almia is widely regarded by fans as the best of the three games, and honestly it's not surprising. I've replayed this one several times, and it takes the ideas and themes from the previous games and it expands on them in really interesting ways. The evil team is again quite similar to the one of the previous game. This time it's Team Dim Sun, and they want to reproduce the styler, but they reproduce it into this weird mind control machine thing. I think they call it the Gigaremo. Again, their objective is just to take over the region and control the legendary Pokemon. The characters in this game have deeper, more fleshed out personalities, I think. The third game in the series is Pokémon Ranger Guardian Signs. This game is set in the Oblivia region, which is a cluster of small islands. It's kind of like a Lola. Again, you choose between a boy and a girl ranger, Ben or Summer. The character which isn't picked becomes your partner in the story, and they follow you around a lot, which is quite different to the past two games where the other character has been there but not as present. Oblivia could be based on the Oki Islands in the Shimane Prefecture of Japan, or at least this is the general consensus among Pokemon fans. This game has the most expansive Ranger decks yet, with 307 out of the 493 Pokemon. In this game you befriend a ukulele playing Pichu as your partner Pokemon, and its ukulele ability can be used to calm down Pokemon during captures. I think ukulele Pichu is a really unique and fun idea. Traditionally your partner Pokemon will just simply attack with its special attack. For example, in the first game, your Plusle or Minun will just electric shock the other Pokemon, or in the second game, whatever Pokemon you've picked as your partner will use their type attack. Ukulele Pichu is really fun. I think it ties into the tropical Hawaii kind of vibes that the game has. Again, Guardian Signs is actually a Gen 4 game, meaning that two Pokemon Ranger games were released over the run of Gen 4. Guardian Signs came out later in Gen 4 and kind of coincided with the release of Heart Gold and Soul Silver, which is why Pichu, I suppose, has been picked as your partner Pokemon to tie into the fact that Johto was big again at the time. Also, Guardian Signs, GS, Gold, Silver, is that a coincidence? Interestingly, in Japan, the game was titled Traces of Light, which makes me think even more that maybe Guardian Signs was kind of a nod to the Gold, Silver that was going on. Or maybe it was just a more appealing, understandable title in the West. Something I noticed while playing this game for the first time recently is that there were some really minor changes to Pokemon's field moves and abilities. I don't think I would have noticed this if I hadn't played the other two games really recently before playing this one. But for some reason, some Pokemon now have different field moves, some have more powerful, some have had them weakened. It's not really a big deal, but it's just something that I noticed and thought was interesting. This game also introduced new features such as styler modification. By collecting ranger points on missions, you can now modify your styler and spend your points on different upgrades like extending the line, extending the power, upgrading your defense, increasing your charge speed. There were similar concepts to this in Shadows of Almia, and you could collect styler upgrades as rewards for doing missions. However, in this one, I think it's harder to gain them as you have to actually pay currency to unlock them. The main gimmick of this game is the titular guardian signs. These are emblems that you draw using the capture styler to summon the powers of legendary Pokemon. For example, you can call Raikou to your aid and ride him around. You can ride Latias, Entei, Suicune. There's a lot of different Pokemon to gain signs for and call for help. They're kind of like Skyrim shouts. To begin with, I found this game easier than the previous two, and I thought the story seemed a lot lower stakes for the first half of the game. This kind of lulled me into a false sense of security because the game really kicks off and shines in the second half, and I think is a really solid competitor to Shadows of Almia for best game in the series. The first time I got a broken styler in the game was quite late in. It was when you have to fight Purple Eyes and his Metagross. I needed a couple of attempts to do it because it's just such an insane boss fight. Like, how are you even meant to do this? There was a real shift in difficulty just straight out of nowhere, and the game really becomes intense, and it matches the mood of the game, which I think works really well, because as the stakes in the story rise, so does the difficulty. New challenges are presented in the story, like a pursuit minigame, where you have to charge up your energy and then dash after an enemy that you're in pursuit of. This is really fun. And there's also flying around in the sky and dodging the enemy ships. Those are also really fun. There's also really challenging puzzles and obstacle courses, which are kind of like a staple of the Ranger games. Characters introduced in this game are really, really memorable and really fun. There's Rand, the Pokemon Ranger who lives on one of the islands of the region. He has a wife who's an archaeologist and a daughter who's kind of like a mad scientist. His daughter Nima is really fun, and she's always coming up with little gadgets and inventions to help you progress in the story. She's also a lot of trouble and constantly rebels against her parents for the sake of helping you out. The evil team in this game are called the Pokemon Pinchers at first. This is kind of what contributed to me believing that this game was going to be easier, lower stakes, less complex than previous ones. On the surface, it seemed like the Pokemon Pinchers were simply just out to steal Pokemon for the hell of it. However, as the game gets further into the story, you soon realise that the Pinchers are more of a cover than anything, and that the real evil team are these old people who call themselves a society. They're a bunch of old people who hang out and drink tea, and they're all introduced as friendly characters throughout the course of the game, so it's a real twist towards the end of the game when they're revealed. The Pinchers don't feel imposing or threatening like the previous evil teams do. However, when their bosses come out of the darkness towards the climax of the story, this is when the stakes really start to feel real and the evil team really do start to feel menacing. They're using the power of these ancient suits of armour to control Pokemon, and it's not touched upon as much as it should be, but these suits of armour are part of the region's history. You travel back in time and learn a little bit about the Iron Heads at the start of the game, and then it kind of never really touches on it again, which is a real shame. I enjoyed getting some background to the region and its history. The evil, crazy madman being the kind island doctor who goes around helping all the sick old people was a real shock to me. I had a few suspicions on who the twist villain or the big baddie could be, and he definitely wasn't one of them. The only character I'd really found suspicious up until that point in the game was Hocus, the magician, who does turn out to be part of the big evil team. I assumed he was something to do with the Pinchers because on his first introduction he literally uses his magic to steal your Pichu as part of his magic act. The true motivations of the villains are definitely a lot more evil than in the previous games. Upon revealing themselves and gaining the Sky Fortress and all of its power, the society goes straight to blowing up an entire island where all the Pokemon live. They then proceed to threaten all of the islands that are actually inhabited by people. Given the tone of the first half of the game, this is a real unexpected and shocking turn, and it's definitely the most exciting villain story in the series. So why has Ranger been forgotten about in the recent years? As of 2014, the original Ranger had sold 2.93 million copies, Shadows of Almia had sold 2.35, and Guardian Signs had sold 1.53 million. Overall, the series had sold 6.1 million copies. This data indicates that the third game was a lot less popular than the first two games, But still, 1.5 million seems like a crazy amount of something to sell to me. However, from a business perspective, I can see why this was seen as a big drop. A fourth Pokemon Ranger game for Gen 5 or 6 would have been absolutely perfect on the 3DS or the Wii U. It seems strange that even with the 3DS's technology they didn't attempt one. The new graphics on the 3DS means that a new Ranger game on that platform could have been similar to X and Y or S. Mystery Dungeon received its own 3D installment, and the sales figures on that series of games weren't that different to that of Ranger, so it's really weird to me that Ranger was seen as a sales failure when it wasn't really performing too differently to Mystery Dungeon, which actually got a remake in the past few years. The commercial failure of the Wii U led to cutbacks at Nintendo, and if there ever was actually plans for a Ranger game on that console, which obviously seems unlikely anyway, it wouldn't have made it past the development stages. So could Ranger be brought back nowadays?
It's my IP to sit on and do nothing with!
With Pokemon Mystery Dungeon and Pokemon Snap both getting reimagined remakes on the Switch, obviously Ranger fans like me are dying for another Ranger game, no matter what. The DS is now entering a period where it's considered a retro console. The game prices are ridiculously high. A lot of the games and ideas are being brought back to be more accessible for the new market and the new audience. A lot of the DS games are getting their remakes. We had BDSP recently. We're getting an XY revisit in the form of a sequel. There was even representation for Gen 5 within the Scarlet and Violet DLC. The Switch has a touchscreen which is barely utilised, and interestingly, it doesn't seem like it's actually made to be played on. It's a really bizarre business decision to me because so much can be done with the touchscreen on the Switch. However, it is minimal use. It seems very fragile. You can use it on the home screen. You can use it to click on the options menu in a few games, but I've never really found I've been able to utilise it in anything. I assume this is something to do with the target market of young children who aren't really used to technology that doesn't have touchscreens, and this is simply for the convenience of them touching the screen as they select a game from the menu. With there being so many different models of Switch, it's hard to say how a Switch remake would be handled for Ranger. Obviously, all Switches have the touchscreen. It could be argued that the capture could be made on the touchscreen like in the old games, but then what about the people who play their Switch docked into the TV? The touchscreen is inaccessible once it's in the dock. There's motion controls, but again, the Switch Lite doesn't have the motion controls. Plus, the accuracy of the touchscreen is really important to creating the captures on Pokemon Ranger. The limitations of the Switch are really interesting considering it's so advanced, and I don't see how a Ranger remake could actually logistically be possible unless the formula was completely shaken up. Realistically, the only way they could bring back Ranger for a modern audience would be to create a iPhone app, unfortunately. Pokemon Go was a pretty popular success until a few years ago, where it definitely saw a decrease in popularity. And Pokemon has a lot of mobile games like Unite, Masters, Cafe Mix, so I think they could bring back the Ranger format somehow in a mobile game. So it's a real shame that Pokemon Ranger kind of just seems to have been completely forgotten nowadays, and it's a shame that we didn't even get anything like a full anime series because the concept is so interesting. It's something that stuck with a lot of fans for a really long time. It has a really dedicated fan base. God bless the 5 other people on the internet who still create content about Pokemon Ranger. But unfortunately, I just don't see it coming back anytime soon. I would love more than anything to see it come back on the Switch 2, even a mobile game, even if it's just a little nod to it in the anime. But for now, it seems like Ranger fans are going to be holding out for a very long time for more Ranger content. That is all of my thoughts on Pokemon Ranger and its logistic viability, I guess. Hopefully I'll post a log of my Salona cosplay because Pokemon Ranger is so important to me. I want to keep this tiny little fan base alive. Maybe if I bully Nintendo enough, they'll bring it back to me somehow. So until next time I talk about Pokemon Ranger, goodbye.